All right, welcome back to Firewall. I'm your host, Bradley Tusk. My guest today is Kevin Baker. The name's probably familiar to a lot of you through his work as a journalist and a novelist and a historian, but he just wrote a new book called The New York Game, Baseball and the Rise of a New City that has a fascinating history of baseball in New York City and how the two come together. And Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. It's like all the things we're interested in here in one shot.
Thanks for having me, Bradley.
So, you know, the one of the things that struck me about the book is it's really it's an argument for New York City, right? It's
Yes.
like it is a book that has a clear position. Like you prefer, you're like New York is where baseball effectively really was in many ways invented, developed, created, and it's a New York City game more than anything else. Tell us why you think that.
Definitely. You know, it's mankind has been playing bat and ball games pretty much since we dropped out of the trees and got on the savannah.
Yeah.
You know, as David Block points out in baseball before we knew it, there are hieroglyphics that survive of ancient Egyptians playing bat and ball. There's a whole dispute. Where was it baseball first played? Everybody from Prague to Pittsfield, Mass. Claims the honors. But what we think of as baseball today is really what were called the Knickerbocker rules or the New York game. It really evolved here in New York City. And the people who run baseball have tried desperately to deny that for over a century.
They want to see more of the heartland.
They wanted to be in a perfect small town, as they said when they selected Cooperstown, without a scintilla of evidence.
Is a perfect small town. Yeah, so you do a good job in the book sort of debunking this theory that Abner Doubleday in Cooperstown invented baseball. So for everyone who's listening who still thinks that is the case, tell them why they're wrong.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Abner Doubleday is fascinating. He's sort of the Forrest Gump of the 19th century. He's on hand when anything happens. The first shot of the Civil War almost hits him. He fires the first one back as an officer in Fort Sumter. He helped hold the line at Gettysburg. He went back with Gettysburg with Abraham Lincoln for the address. He used to go to seances at the White House with Mary Todd Lincoln. He held the first cable car franchise in San Francisco. He read Sanskrit. He corresponded with Ralph Waldo Emerson, but he did not invent.
So why does he
baseball.
get the credit for it?
and you know, because this commission was set up by the people running the game, led by A.G. Spalding of sporting goods fame. And they wanted to, prove it didn't come from some other country. Baseball was all American. Yeah. So they seized upon this letter by this kind of senile crank from the West to say he invented it one day along the banks of the Glimmerglass. Trouble was, nobody really believed it even at the time. One of the guys on the commission had been Doubleday's closest friend, including the 20 years when he was the president of the National League. And he admitted Doubleday never mentioned inventing baseball to him, Right.
He probably just forgot. He's doing something between Fort Sumter and Gettysburg. He didn't have time.
That thing you run, I invented it. No, it never came up. So, the essential thing was they wanted to put it in this great little small, and it is a great town. It's a wonderful town. I've been to Cooperstown twice. Terrific town. Terrific. But you know who's not in Cooperstown?
Abner Doubleday.
Abner Doubleday. Not even they can stomach it.
Right. So if someone were, or a group of people, to receive credit for inventing the modern day, the Knickerbocker version of baseball, who would they be?
Well, I think the closest you have is a guy who should be in the Hall of Fame, Daniel Lucius Doc Adams, who I'm kind of surprised baseball has not pushed more, because he's an amazing character. He was the first real shortstop. He was the guy who first got the hard ball going. He got tired of running out to left field and doing these relay throws, so he got a hard ball made. He was an abolitionist. He used to donate all kinds of spare time to free clinics, and he described his marriage as the crowning achievement of his life. Who better?
Yeah, that guy sounds pretty all-American.
But baseball doesn't want to connect with the city. And he was he didn't invent it, but he was the recording secretary of the New York Knickerbockers Club, who also didn't invent baseball, but he was the guy who consolidated the rules, who put them down in paper, And this is what became the modern game.
So yeah, I mean, people invent all kinds of games all the time.
Yeah.
To your point, I remember going to look at Mayan ruins in southern Mexico and seeing like ball fields that they had there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Although I don't know if this is true or just how I chose to remember it, but that
Yeah.
instead of a ball, they used human heads. Probably not true, but sometimes
Right.
something comes together and clicks, and people broadly say, "Ooh, I like that."
Yeah.
And it develops into something, and ours became the national pastime. What were those precipitating events?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's John Thorne, who's a brilliant historian of early baseball, really terrific, and he talks about, he prefers the Massachusetts game, which is basically a running game. You had one out an inning, and you only got the batters out by throwing and hitting them with the ball.
That is kind of fun.
And you could, and you could hit the ball behind you, and there was no fair or foul territory.
Right.
It sounds like a Looney Tune cartoon. How do you put a stadium around that, though? And as Thorne also points out, gambling was huge in getting professional baseball going.
And was there something about baseball that made it more appealing to gamblers than some other sport?
Well, yeah. I mean, basically, there almost were no sports. The National Association of Professional Baseball Players, from the best I can find, it's the first league anywhere. I mean, anywhere. Other countries, high school league or something. This is the start of it. So this very quickly consolidated in New York as all kinds of entertainment ideas
Right.
consolidated here. There wasn't much going on in New York. You had wonderful pastimes like rat baiting,
Yeah,
where
was
you
fun.
would bet on how long it would take a trained rat terrier to kill 100 rats. You can imagine.
Wait, there was bear baiting too, right?
Before that, there was bear
Yeah.
baiting.
I think the rat.
There was a-
baiting
you said there was bear
14
baiting
minutes
on-
in 12 seconds.
On 10th
Yeah,
Street.
yeah. There's the great.
Lower East Side, we could still probably use that. By the way.
The great Lucy Sant has a terrier named Jack Underhill was the champion rat killer.
baiter,
But
yeah.
can imagine going into these places that stank, that were awful.
Yeah.
There was bear baiting. There was people would bet on a guy in boots stomping rats. They would bet on having dogs kill a cow a steer that was tied to a post. Horrible sports.
Yeah.
Baseball, by contrast, is like
Very
really
wholesome.
fun.
Yeah.
Very wholesome.
Yeah.
And quick. All these early people.
It's true. Waiting for all those rats to die could take a while.
Yeah.
So, New York City, has always been a sort of unique, vibrant, changing place. How much did that specific culture, and there's just kind of like nowhere else in the world quite like New York, how much of that led to the development of the game, and how much of the game kind of influenced the culture of the city?
Yeah, both very much. It's the city was a melting pot, and very early on, people of all classes, almost all colors, all backgrounds could go into could go play on these lots against each other, and they would play and fight and make up and meet both in the stands and on the field, and this was great. Of course, the almost too is key. Very early on, there were attempts to exclude black players, and that went on and on. I mean, there were 55 known black players in the organized leagues, minor and major, before 1884, and then the color wall goes up, and they're officially, they're de facto banned from playing until Jackie Robinson signs.
So in those early days, sort of turn of the 20th century, New York, what teams did we have, and who were their fans? What was the culture of each?
Well, we had, early on in the, we had the New York Giants, who were originally called the Gothams.
Yeah.
They were very popular, became very much the Irish team. My father, who was born on Fordham Road, was a Giants fan, so was my uncle. They were before Jacob Rupert bought the Yankees and transformed all of sports. The Giants were sort of the big team in town. You had the Brooklyn Dodgers from the 1880s on, who were already scrappy and beloved by Brooklynites, but barely hanging on by their fingernails.
Somehow the Dodgers of today seem like they're going to make it.
Yeah, the Dodgers now are such a massive organization, but they had become really in the era after World War II. They had become America's team. They had a huge radio network, going into TV. Everybody loved them. They were the first integrated team.
Yep.
Everybody loved Brooklyn. And then Walter O'Malley took them off to the coast. But that's
probably smart in a way. But
that's
and then the Yankees were the Highlanders?
The Yankees were the Highlanders. You know, they're...
just because most people don't know the geography of New York, why were they called the Highlanders?
The Yankees were called the Highlanders both because they were playing north of the Giants in the Polo Grounds, but also because they were on Washington Heights, right where the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center is today. And this was in this awful park, Hilltop Park, also known as the Rock Pile, which should tell you something. Like all the early teams, they were very connected to Tammany Hall. You had to be. Otherwise, they might run a street through your ballpark, which happened on more than one occasion. So they were owned by Bill Devery, who was the most corrupt police chief in the history of New York City, which is saying something.
Yeah, I'd say that's a hard title to win.
The position was eliminated because he was so corrupt.
Bernie Carrick will give him a run for his money.
Lincoln Steffens had a thing. It was like he was a great character, but he had no more business of being in charge of the police than the fishman had being in charge of the aquarium. It was him. There was a guy named Frank Farrell who ran the biggest gambling operations in baseball. And you quickly had the most corrupt player in baseball on the team, a guy named Hal Chase. So they went nowhere. They had to move out of their park once Tammany decided to knock it down. They went to the Polo Grounds. They were renters. They were known for their bad luck. It was always called, the Yankees were the jinx team. They were not going to ever do anything. And then that changed.
So that the two figures that I would guess that you would attribute would be Jacob Ruppert and Babe Ruth.
Exactly.
Right. So tell me the influence on both. And then one of the things I was kind of wondering as I was reading this is, let's say Ruth had been traded to Cleveland or Philadelphia or just to some other deal. Like, does the whole history of baseball change?
I think so. Ruth would have been incredible anywhere. But coming to New York, the man and the time and the city were met. He, I think, is the most transformational athlete in history because he brings American sports into the big time. And by the same token, Ruppert is the most transformational owner.
So explain. So we all know Ruth, but explain Jacob Ruppert and why he was this way.
Jacob Ruppert inherited a brewery, which is always nice. Yeah. He was a Tammany congressman for 4 terms. He spoke with a heavy German accent and was very necessary in recruiting new German immigrants to the machine. He was also cold and ruthless and a very good businessman. And when he took over the Yankees, he wanted to make them into a major contender. And that became more urgent with Prohibition because he couldn't sell his beer legally anywhere. So here it is in the 20s. He has to make this team work. And he really wanted to get hold of great players. And he did with Ruth. He bought him from the Red Sox. He was officially traded from the Red Sox. He acquired a lot of the other best players on the Red Sox. At one point, he actually owned the mortgage on Fenway Park in Boston.
That's how he got the deal done.
He could, because that was part of the deal. That was part of the loan. He got all these deals done, and that tells you something about baseball. Because the guy who owned the Boston Red Sox, reviled in Boston to this day, was Harry Frazee. He was also a he was also a Broadway theater producer. And and the famous thing in Boston is, he sold Babe Ruth so he could put on No No Nanette, which is pretty true. But the thing is, Broadway was much bigger than baseball then. He made a lot more money on Broadway. Baseball was about the...
Right, he didn't need that.
Yeah, baseball was about... he did that. Of course he was going to do that to fund his big industry as opposed to little baseball. Baseball at the time was about the equivalent of sheet music as an industry. The profits were around the same.
Wow. So 2 quick modern day comps, because it's very hard for me as a baseball fanatic to not keep doing that. One would be, given that you have about as good of a sense of Ruth as just about anybody these days, Ohtani, right? We
Yeah.
like to compare Ohtani to Ruth, and I know that I assume you've never met Ohtani in person.
No, I never
right?
have.
No one really has, right? So, based on what you know of Ohtani, what you know of Ruth, how apt or not is the comparison?
The comparison is overstated, and that's not
Okay.
to put down Ohtani. He was
Yeah.
an amazing player. But Ruth was the best left-handed pitcher in the game as a starting pitcher, and he regularly beat the best right-handed pitcher in head-to-head, Walter Johnson.
Yeah.
And then he became this outstanding outfielder and, a fantastic hitter. Ohtani doesn't really play the field. He's really a pitcher who DHs a lot.
Yeah.
So Ruth transformed the game and therefore transformed all games. It's almost as if you had Michael Jordan had been a guard and then changed to being a center and scored so many points they had to change the rules of the game. It's stunning what he did. So he's on a much higher level. And as such, he was kind of the savior of baseball after the 1919 World Series fixing scandal.
Are you when people in Boston complain that the trading away of Mookie Betts is the modern day equivalent of giving away Ruth, are you sympathetic to that argument?
Yeah, no, that was a pretty bad trade. But
by the way, I also got to play a lot of positions.
Yeah,
really well.
got to play a lot of positions. He's a terrific player. There were a few other people like Ruth. In the 19th century, John Montgomery Ward, who led the Players League, was also a very good pitcher. His arm became a shortstop. And this is part of the tragedy of baseball again. Martin Dehigo, who was a great Negro League player for the Cubans, the New York Cubans and Cuban Giants. Fantastic player, played every position on the field pretty much except catcher. Also an outstanding pitcher late into his career. And that's one of the tragedies of baseball, that he never got the recognition or the compensation he should have, but also that we missed seeing him play. Dehigo is now in 3 Halls of Fame, Mexico, Cuba, and America. And it would have been great to have seen him out there, see what he could do. But unfortunately, because of the racism of the era, we didn't.
So what were, in those kind of first 20, 30 years of the 20th century, what were the Negro League teams like in New York?
The Negro League teams were, the best Negro League teams generally weren't in New York. You did have the Lincoln Giants, though, briefly before the First World War, and they had some of the all-time greatest players. Oscar Charleston, Spotswood Poles, Cannonball Dick Redding, Cyclone Joe Williams, these great pitchers. Louis Santop, a fantastic catcher. That team would have given any New York team ever, and New York's had probably the 3 or 4 greatest teams, they would have given any New York team a run for its money. And they were virtually unknown. They played in these horrible little sandlots, basically. And then later you had the Cubans, who were a fascinating story. They were brought about by Alex Pompez, this guy who ran a cigar shop and a policy bank. And his real love, though, was baseball. And he built this team starting with Cuban players and then Caribbean players and then black players in general. Great team in the 30s and 40s. He had a bit of a bumpy ride there. One day, Dutch Schultz's goons come into a cigar store and say, "You're working for us now. Your policy bank is ours." Shortly afterwards, Tom Dewey's assistant DAs come in and say, "You're testifying against Dutch Schultz." So he did the only sensible thing. He took it on the lam to Mexico City.
He fled, yeah. What else can you do? Yeah.
By the time he came back, Dutch Schultz was dead, and he could testify, but his ballpark was gone, the Dyckman Oval in upper Manhattan. Yeah. So his team becomes the one and only Negro League team that becomes a minor league for a major league team, which was the New York Giants.
So of the ballparks, contrast for us Ebbets Field, Yankee Stadium, Polo Grounds, and if you could go back in time and go to a game at one of them, which would you pick?
Okay, well, I was in the OG Yankee Stadium, which is amazing.
Okay.
It was like a cathedral from the Ebbets Field is an incredible little park, very intimate. The fans right on top, crazy quilt thing, hit sign, windsuit, the famous, had a chain link fence in right field. Polo Grounds, though, is what I'd really like to see.
Why?
Because it sounds insane. It was really kind of horseshoe shaped.
Yeah.
Vast outfield. And these 257, 279-foot shots down the line, but led to two of the most memorable plays in baseball history. Bobby Thompson's home run and Willie Mace's catch, which is like, almost 500 feet away from home.
And, now that I'm thinking about it, in terms of like literary history, as sort of much as sort of all these great writers came from Brooklyn, and probably love the Dodgers, the beginning of Underworld, Don DeLillo's book, it captures the Polo Grounds and that in a way that, like, I don't think I've read anything fictional about baseball like that.
Fantastic book.
So how much do you think, when Fred Wilpon built Citi Field, which is one of the things Fred actually did quite well, there weren't a lot, but that was one of them. It was all meant to be sort of, nostalgic nod to the Ebbets Field of his childhood. How much do you think that's true?
I think it is. It very much resembles Ebbets Field. It's a terrific neighborhood ballpark.
That's great.
Without a neighborhood, which is a little strange, but much better than the latest Yankee Stadium, which is
a mausoleum.
Yeah, a mausoleum and just purely for profit and big LED lights, and it's terrible.
Yeah, it's interesting with Citi Field. Part of it is because I go season ticket holder, so sadly I have to go there a lot. And there are some areas around it, like Corona, that are kind of fun, and then you have obviously just all the chop shops of 126th Street that have been on the docket to be removed and replaced with high rises and malls and casinos forever.
A marina.
And arena soccer. And look, Steve Cohen probably does have the resources to do a lot of these things. But it's funny how like my entire life, those places without running water were about to disappear any minute now, and they're 126th Street, and they're still there.
It's interesting. I hope they do hang on somehow. The Mets, though, that's not a departure. Sadly, people who have owned baseball teams in New York throughout its history could care less about the people near them. The Giants got out of East Harlem, frankly, because they felt it was getting too black and Hispanic. They wanted to move to Minneapolis, which would have been a great idea. San Francisco, great town, but still tiny market compared to New York.
Right.
Idiotic move, particularly when they had all these great black and Latino players about to come in. The Dodgers, similar thing. They were willing to settle for building a park in Brooklyn where Barclays Arena is now. Yeah. But they also wanted to get out of an area they felt was too dark. And that's really a shame. But they don't care. The owners of these teams don't care about the neighborhood. They don't care about the city. They've taken huge subsidies and yet reduced the number of seats available to the average fans in favor of luxury boxes. Should never have happened.
Yeah. Tell me if this sounds right, which would be, you'd have to almost say Ruth, Robinson, Mays, and then if you threw in a Met, Seaver.
Yeah. I think that's true. I think that does work. Yeah.
Give me the next four.
The next four, well, DiMaggio, Mantle, Lou Gehrig, who is also from New York, greatest player ever from New York. Who would be? Well, of course, and maybe somebody who should be on the first one, who was everything in New York for over 50 years, Casey Stengel.
Oh, right.
The Mets Park really should be named for Casey Stengel.
Yeah, he does have that. Right? Did you?
I don't think the Stengel family offered as much as Citibank for the.
Yeah, exactly.
It was close. They were like 10%.
I mean, they went, and Stengel actually was a banker too.
Right.
But I mean, Citibank, this bank,
how tall was he in real life?
Oh, Casey? I think he was around 6 feet. I'm not sure. But,
okay. All right. Because
he was a tall enough
guy. Have you been to the museum at Citi Field?
I have not.
Okay. So there's a museum that I drag everyone to all the time. And they do have this sculpture of Casey, but he's very small. My kids always liked it when they were little. Ruth and Gehrig.
Yeah.
Their relationship, how should people think about
it? Good at first. It really soured for what are still mysterious reasons. It may have been due to the fact that on the ship to Japan, where they were going to play a barnstorming tour, Gehrig may have caught Mrs. Gehrig, a former baseball Annie, in Ruth's stateroom doing something with Ruth and his wife. Unclear exactly. Might have just been
exciting.
getting drunk, which would have really ticked off Lou, Lou. It might have been a virgin before he married her. He was an oddly, very smart guy. He used to cry at opera. Was at Columbia's engineering school, but very childlike in some ways. Used to go and ride the roller coaster a lot at Rye Playland. Come home after a game and play with the kids in the neighborhood. He was very upset by whatever happened in that room and never really forgave Ruth. The famous day where they're honoring Gehrig and he gives the "I'm the luckiest man" speech.
Yeah.
Afterwards, Ruth is moved to tears and flings his arms around Gehrig. And Gehrig smiles wanly, but according to people who were there, that didn't even do it. Still didn't
push them away.
Still didn't forget. Well, it just didn't return the embrace. So
the lot of historic managers throughout New York history, and you mentioned Casey, obviously McCarthy. Who would you say is sort of the greatest New York manager ever, or at least let's take the period of your book. Yeah. So basically, late 19th century into Jackie Robinson.
All kinds of managers: Smiling Jeeves, Mutry, Marsh Joe McCarthy, Ned Hanlon, who becomes the grandfather of all managers. He begets John McGraw, who begets Casey Stengel, who begets Billy Martin, all the way, Tony La Russa, all the way through to the present day. I'd say the greatest is Casey, who was often shackled to a lot of bad teams, but when he had a chance to do it, was great. Came within a hair's breadth of winning 9 World Series and won 7. So a lot of people. Bill James goes for Joe McCarthy.
Yep.
But Joe McCarthy's teams were so dominant that it's hard. People called him a push button manager, which he wasn't. He was a very smart manager, but it's hard to say. Almost anybody wouldn't have won with those teams.
Put Ruth and Gehrig in the lineup. Okay.
Yeah.
And Branch Rickey, would you say he was the best executive?
Oh, yeah, fascinating. Well, the most transformative one really was Rupert. But Rickey was the best. He was the one determined to break the color line. He did it he was accused of just doing it for monetary reasons by F.M. Manley, one of the Negro League team owners. And money was always a factor with Rickey. They used to say that he had 2 loves in his life, ball players and money, and he was determined that they should never meet. But he really did seem to feel this was wrong on a moral level. And he broke the color line. Difficult to do. Major League owners voted 15-1 against letting black players play, overridden by Happy Chandler, the commissioner. So, but it was Rickey who really forced the issue and brought this about.
Would you say that baseball is still the New York sport, or do you think basketball has eclipsed it?
I think baseball may still be the New York sport. It's more of the city's favorite sport than it is probably anywhere else, save maybe St. Louis. Possibly Boston, although Boston just wins everything nowadays.
Yeah, so, and ever after the Patriots won all those, it's hard to...
Bastards, That and the Celtics are great again. It's a hard century for New York.
But you're from Massachusetts, right?
I was born in New Jersey, moved up there already a Yankees fan.
Oh, that's brutal.
The day of 1967, the incredible dream summer, probably would have become a Red Sox fan, but they called my favorite ball player Mickey Mantle. And I could never forgive them that.
Yeah,
it was a great place to grow up.
Good that you hold a grudge. What if you look at the current Met and Yankee rosters? Who would have fit in the best with sort of the old time teams?
Gosh, I think Aaron Judge would fit in anywhere.
Yeah, just because he's just so good.
Yeah,
it seems like a guy that could kind of get along with.
Pete Alonso, terrific player, terrific personality. He would have to probably change his game a little for the older game. People just didn't strike out in anywhere near the numbers. Ruth never struck out 100 times in a season. So it's a different game. I wish the game would go back to that a little more. I wish there were fewer rules and more culture, which I think is true about a lot of America now.
Yeah, we're becoming a more rules-oriented society. Although, what do you think of things like the pitch clock?
Yeah, I think the pitch clock is probably a good idea because it has to be there. Otherwise, the game would be too slow. I think the anti-shift rule is good, but in the old days, you would have got rid of the shift in about 5 minutes. But people tried shifts before. Even the likes of Ruth or Mickey Mantle would just bunt on it, or they would hit to the opposite field.
Right, but no, it doesn't anymore.
That needs to be the culture.
You ever tried?
that gets
It's funny
back to.
when I hadn't scored a game when I was a kid. I
Yeah,
used to like to
right.
do it, and then I hadn't done it forever. And then I was teaching my daughter how to score a game, and I hadn't since the sort of shift became a thing again. This before it was banned.
Yeah.
You ever try scoring a game with the shift?
Yeah.
I have no idea where the second baseman is and the shortstop, and no one's ever in the right spot.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's really deceptive. And that's the sort of thing that baseball's culture should be able to solve. Same thing with the pitching now. Ron Darling has been just brilliant on this, talking about how you have more and more and less and less. You have 13 pitchers on the staff, and nobody can throw 5 innings.
Right.
This
So yeah, I was going to ask you about this because you had these guys that were these incredible workhorses, right? I mean, Cy Young had like 511 wins or something like that, right?
500. Yeah.
But it seems today that I think I read something like there's 100. I was listening to someone's podcast. There's like 168 guys started the year on the IL, and like 130 were pitchers, right? And the evolution of pitching is such that basically the human arm can't seem to withstand the velocity at which they're throwing the ball. Why did the arm seem to hold up so well 100 years ago?
I mean, you go back to the dead ball era, and the thing is that the ball really was dead, and you had to return it. You hit the ball in the stands, they made you give it back. So by the end of the day, you're playing in the dusk, and you have this ball that's literally about to fall apart. You couldn't hit it very far. That led to a lot of innings pitched. Also, you could spit on it, you could put anything on it, but in the lively ball era, people used to. In my lifetime, people used to pitch many more innings, and that's again with culture to a great degree. They knew how to pitch. They pitched to contact. The Yankees brag about having this gas station, which a lot of teams do now, where they take you in as a new pitcher and they put 5 miles an hour more in your fastball and give you more torque. And 2 minutes later, you're spending a year and a half of your prime playing years on the DL.
UCL surgery. Right. I mean,
Yeah.
DeGrom is sort of the perfect example of that, right? It's like, I mean, he's tall, but when you see him live, I remember once I went to spring training where like really got to see him because we were like right next to the batting cage where he was actually taking batting practice, and very good, by the way.
Yeah.
He's not that big of a dude, and yet he learned how to throw the ball, partly because he's just really smart, 102 miles on basically every pitch, and then could never really stay healthy for more than a few months at a time.
I mean, the famous example is Sandy Koufax, who actually had to learn to throw slower with more control. And that's how it used to be. You look at a lot of the old pitchers who did go a lot of innings, like in the 40s or 50s. I was looking with a friend, we were looking at early win statistics. He would have like a terrible year, then all of a sudden a really good year. And you get the idea that guys hurt their arms all the time, but they kind of taught themselves or were taught to pitch through it. Again, probably by pitching to contact.
Right. It's interesting how pitching and catching are two things where you're probably somewhat debilitated for the rest of your life when your career is over. But then remember reading an interview with Dave Winfield once because he was drafted in the first round in the NFL and then drafted in the NBA, and he said, "I made the right call."
Yeah.
And I think part of his point was I'm like a healthy man, right? Like a right fielder doesn't really take on that much wear and tear. And he got to play for 22 years or something like that, made tons of money, Hall of Fame. I think he won a couple of World Series with the Blue Jays. Do you think that baseball players overall have it better than other athletes because it is just pitching aside less wear and tear? Or do you think that these days it's just the whole thing is insane?
It's the culture as it stands now leads to more wear and tear than it used to.
Yeah.
But still, it's much less wear and tear than you have in basketball, or particularly in football.
Yeah.
You look at guys like Mays and Mantle. They were in incredible shape. They weren't that big guys. And they were outstanding high school football players. And today, somebody probably would have given them a scholarship somewhere, and they would have played great at some university for a year or two, and then they would have been just demolished.
Right.
And that's
Johnny Manziel.
and I think that's the thing baseball should push to try to regain its popularity. Really going in, particularly in urban areas, and talking to these kids and saying, "You're a great athlete. You'll last 5 minutes in football. You'll last maybe 10
And get
minutes in
CTE.
basketball." I'm sorry.
And get CTE if you play
Yeah,
football.
yeah,
right?
exactly. You know, whereas with baseball, this is you won't get permanently damaged.
So that actually leads perfectly to my last topic, which is, so there are people who just love the sport, like you and me, right? But overall, the average fan is something like a 56-year-old white guy, right? And my kids like baseball, but only because I have absolutely drummed it into them viciously, and make them just keep coming with me to games.
Also, you have really good tickets.
I have really good seats too, but overall, my son's, he's 15. His friends, they when they come over, they watch basketball, right?
Yeah.
Like they never put a baseball game on. So if you were Rob Manfred, or if Manfred just called you and said, "Okay, Kevin, you clearly understand the history of this game quite well. Tell me what things I should do to try to recapture the game's popularity," what would you do?
I think baseball has to actively get at it. I all the time I'm out running or walking and I see these empty ball fields in Manhattan. I think baseball should get kids on those fields. I think they should have major leaguers going into inner cities, talking to kids. They should really be pushing it as this is a fun sport. This is a sport you won't get badly hurt at. It'll be hard. I don't know if you'll ever get rid of football as the favorite sport of Americans. I think even when robots are playing it, Americans will probably
of the 100 top Nielsen rated, not just sports, but overall. 93 were football last year.
Yeah. Football is an ideal TV game.
Perfect.
Football has a certain
Stinks
amount of
to go
violence.
to,
It's interesting. I mean, soccer is the sport of the future in America, and it always will be.
Right. It's been the sport of the future since I was. Hugo's slightly unhappy with that comment because he's one of those guys that gets up at 5:30 on Saturday to watch Premier League. But
I love soccer, but it's just not going to take off.
No, it's been the sport of the next moment since I was a kid.
Yeah, exactly.
And what if you just said, okay, you know what? Baseball. So the downside is it's less popular in the U.S.
Yes.
The upside is it is a truly global game now, right? I haven't done the math on it, but at least a third of the guys on the roster have to be from Latin America, especially if you include Puerto Rico, right? And then the Asian number is just going to keep going up and up and up. It should, and that's, by the way, one of the reasons why whether Ohtani is guilty of gambling or not, he's not going to be guilty of gambling.
Right.
The last thing you're going to do is put all of that at risk, right? Nor should they. What about the argument that just, you know what? We're a global world now. We all share media the same way. And so what if it's a little less popular in the U.S.? And so what if we get to a world where only a quarter of the players are American born? And so what if more of the viewers are in Korea, than in Kentucky?
I think that would be fine. I think baseball, like a lot of things in the U.S., would do itself better by sort of imploding. It's, among other things, in terms of keeping up young fan interest. It's way too expensive. It's way too expensive to go to a game.
Yeah.
It's way too expensive, these cable packages. Now they're going to have streaming.
Yeah.
All these ways to watching a game. It's way too hard. Baseball would be better off taking the money all down a couple of notches.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's going to happen.
It's unlikely.
Yeah.
But betting against capitalism is a really tough one. Although I will say, last night, so I'm watching the Mets game, and it ended up going great, but they were down 4-0 early, and I just kind of pressed a button to see what else was on Hulu. And it seems to be more. I ended up watching Toronto-Seattle for a couple of innings.
Oh, yeah?
Where, I didn't know I had that. That was pretty cool. I'm sure I'm paying somebody for it. So I guess if you are a fanatic. Do you play fantasy?
I don't. But interesting to discover, there was a form of fantasy baseball during World War II to raise money in New York, where you
for the war.
Yeah, you got war bonds, and you followed players, and if they did well, then
interesting.
You got more. Yeah. So, but baseball, it's too expensive. It's too much trouble, going to these games and paying this and taking a family. My goodness, it's crazy now.
Yeah.
It used to be 1970s. I'd go get a day of the game ticket for $250, sit high up in Yankee Stadium.
Right.
But you could go around behind home plate, great view. It costs less than a movie at those days.
So now I am going. So I've never been to Pittsburgh, and I've been taking my kids, especially my son, all over the country. We've been going to different ballparks.
Oh, great.
And we hadn't been to PNC, and so we're going Memorial Day weekend. And even Pittsburgh, which is like, I mean, no, they're sort of having a good start to the year, but they're historically an inept franchise.
Yeah.
It ended up being 7 people in our group, and I still spent like $1,500 on the tickets or something like that, right? Pittsburgh, it really kind of surprised me.
Crazy.
How much money it was.
Crazy. Well, and that's sort of the socialism for me, but not for thee thing with sports, and particularly in baseball. What is a league but a cartel?
Yes.
And this is from
with an antitrust exemption.
Yeah, from the get-go, baseball always kind of wants to operate by, and for years, these kind of annoying people in New York kept breaking that up. All of a sudden, here's Jacob Rupert. No, I want the best players. Right. Here's Branch Rickey. I want black players to play, which means you can't have separate Negro League teams that play in your ballpark and pay you rent when your team's away. Here's George Steinbrenner. I'm insane, but I want my team to win.
Right. Oh, as a Mets fan, we're so grateful for Cohen. Right,
Cohen. I hope
he's like Steinbrenner.
I hope he's another disruptor. I don't know if he will be, but it is sad to see how little of disruptor Hal is with the Yankees now. He's fallen into line. This is what all these guys want to do now. They want to fall into line, make the profits.
Well, the thing with Hal though is, he was Lucky Sperm Club, right? And like if baseball is your passion, like it was for Steinbrenner, like I think it is for Cohen, and you made the money, then you will say it rightfully makes sense to me to risk more of my money or spend more of my money to pursue this thing I really love. If it's truly just a business to you, like it is for Hal, seems to be for Hal, his choices aren't irrational. I wouldn't like it as a Yankee fan if I were one, but they're not. They kind of make sense.
Oh yeah, I have no idea. I never met Hal Steinbrenner.
Neither.
I imagine on some level of his being, though, he probably hates baseball. Having grown up with George Steinbrenner, I can't imagine.
Yeah, not the easiest dad.
And apparently he's a very nice employer. He doesn't like to fire people, as you see with Brian Cashman lasting this long. He hates to, he likes to get along. You can see he's probably thinking, why should I risk stuff? Why should I risk $350 million on Yamamoto as a pitcher? I'm doing.
They're going to
fine.
have to sign. I mean, I hope they don't sign Soto because I hope the Mets do. But where would you put the expansion franchises?
Where would I put them? Yeah. Oh gosh, interesting question. Maybe Nashville. Okay. I'm not sure of the demographics of some of these towns, but Nashville seems like an interesting place.
It's just growing like crazy.
Yeah,
right.
The really bold move would be to sign some kind of treaty with Cuba and put a team
that
in
would
Havana,
be amazing.
That
would be. So what do you think about Mexico City?
Oh, Mexico City would also be incredible.
Yeah.
I don't know how the higher elevation affects the game there, but Colorado certainly could.
We know.
Yeah, that would be great. I don't know if Mexico would prefer to have the Mexican League broken up or not, but
I think there's validation of it'll be interesting to see between the NFL, the NBA, and baseball. Who gets to Mexico City first?
Yeah. Portland, Oregon would be an interesting place to put
NHL is going into Mexico City first.
Who is?
Really?
No.
Yeah.
Oh, that's like really? Did anyone there watch hockey?
The NHL is so bizarre. There's all these like warm weather franchises.
Right. They're right. I don't watch hockey, and then once in a blue moon, I'll just for some reason look at the standings. I'm like, there's a team in Atlanta?
Ridiculous. And for years, they all moved out of Canada.
In fact, there's not a team in Atlanta.
I did discover that eventually.
But there is in Tampa Bay, which is nuts.
Right.
No, it's interesting to see. Maybe San Antonio.
It's funny. It's like the 8th biggest city, and nobody realizes that.
Yeah,
but it's a poor city.
But big Hispanic population.
Yep.
You would think someplace like that would.
And Austin is only an hour drive from San Antonio. It's you could even arguably put it in between the two. I think eventually it will all just fill into one giant megalopolis anyway.
Right.
So you could just stick it between the two and make it an Austin San Antonio kind of regional team. In fact, my son was down. His grandmother lives in Austin. Was there for spring break, and the Spurs played at the UT basketball stadium. And he said it was like amazing. He said it was packed, and people were really excited about it. So maybe you could have two cities kind of co-own a team.
Yeah, people would. I don't know why San Jose doesn't have a team except the Giants seem to have that territory.
There's
or
something
nonsense.
and then I get there's got to be some reason why the A's aren't going to Sacramento
Yeah.
and not there.
Yeah.
Right. That doesn't make any sense.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and I would look. Did you ever get to Olympic Stadium, Montreal? I never.
I did not.
But
did.
It's such a wonderful city that it would be a fun. I mean, I guess once a team fails in the city, there's really no reason to go back. But that would be a fun place.
And I think they failed in part because under financed ownership. It's a great city. It's a huge
the Bronfmans
city.
were wealthy people.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
They weren't.
Oh, that's right. The Bronfmans owned them. Yeah, I don't know why.
I mean, it wasn't like they lacked.
Yeah.
They had as much money as anybody.
I remember reading how crazy
TV contracts were probably much smaller.
Yeah. And Bronfman sort of ran Gary Carter out of the city for some reason. I don't know. It's weird. How nobody likes Gary Carter.
Carter caught his wife in a suite on a ship with Bronfman and his wife. We don't know what happened, but something
don't
did.
know what's
and
going on.
They never got over it. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. Super fun. The book is The New York Game, Baseball on the Rise of New York City, or of a New City. Highly recommend it. And then we're going to have Kevin at some point at P&T Knitwear. So if you like this, we'll make sure the listeners know about it. And those of you in New York, come check it out.
Great bookstore. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Thanks for coming. Firewall is recorded in my bookstore, P&T Knitwear, located at 180 Orchard Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We'd love to hear from you with questions, feedbacks, or idea for a guest. Just email me at bradley@firewall.media or find me on LinkedIn. And to keep up with what's on my mind and my latest writing, please follow my new Substack at bradleytusk.substack.com. Thanks again for listening.